Hey there, welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. I hope you're ready to make an awesome looking web page, because in today's video, we're going to take the web page we designed in the last video and actually build it using HTML and CSS. And don't worry, if you haven't seen the last video, you don't need to see it to watch this video. But if you're interested in learning the design process behind this web page we're about to build, make sure to check out that video linked in the description after you're done watching this one. Also, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe for more videos of me simplifying the web for you. Let's get started now. To get started, here are the two designs that we created in the last video. We have our desktop version as well as our mobile version. And the very first thing that we need to do before we can get started is actually export all of the different images and assets that we need. So for example, all these icons that we need to export into our project that we're going to work on. And this is actually really easy to do inside of Figma. All you need to do is just select the icon, come down here, click export, and we want to make sure we export these as SVGs. So we select XVG and then just click the export button and it'll export it for us. But I've already taken care of that and exported all of the images inside of this images folder here inside of our project. Also, I have the video that I'm going to be using for this video section, as well as the thumbnail for that video. And lastly, I have the font that I'm going to be using for this project stored in this fonts folder here. Again, you don't need to use these exact assets that I have, but if you do want to use these exact assets, I have them linked on my GitHub repository, which is in the description down below, where you can find all of these different assets that I have used here, as well as the final code for the project. Now with all that out of the way, all the assets taken care of, let's actually work on building the page that we need. And the very first thing we need is an index.html page. So to do that, we can just come up here, create a new page, index.html. And to get started with the boilerplate, just type exclamation point and hit enter, and that'll build it all out for you if you're using something like VS Code with Emmet installed. Let's increase the size here a little bit. And you may notice that I also have this file over here called normalize.css. This can be found if you just Google normalize.css, or you can find it on my GitHub where I have this entire project linked. But essentially what this does is it defaults the browser to have some really nice defaults, such as a better line height, such as no margins on the body, and things like that, which makes it just easier to work with your project across different browsers. It's a great CSS file that I include in almost every project that I work on. So the first thing we want to do is actually link that inside of our head here. Let's expand the room that we have to work with. Add that link tag. Make sure we put an href here, and we want to link this to normalize CSS. And we first want to tell it here that this is a style sheet, so we'll say rel is going to equal, style sheet, just like that. So now we have our normalized CSS being included inside of our documentation. Also, we can change this title here. We're just going to change it to Web Dev Simplified, since again, this is a site for my email signup list. And now let's actually look at what we need to build. As you can see, we have our header, we have our main section here with the email. This is the main input area. And then we have the main section that kind of describes all of the content as well as has the video for our product. So let's first focus on building out the HTML for this header section. So what we know we need to do is we need a header tag because this is our header. And inside of here, we're going to have three different sections. We're going to have the top section, which is our brand icon, our title, and our subtitle. And if you remember, when we designed this, we actually used a grid layout to lay everything out. So first we want to wrap everything inside of a grid. So let's just create a div to do that. And we're just going to give it here a class of grid for now to work with. And we also are going to give it another class of dark header, because this is going to signify this is everything in the dark section of our header, because our header is actually broken up into this dark section and this light section. So we need to make sure we differentiate between the two. So now inside of here, what we know is we have a grid, and that grid is going to contain essentially this section, which is all in the same grid. It's just going to be called our content. So we're going to create another div, which we're going to give a class of content. And this is going to be where we're going to put everything in this top section of our grid, this dark blue area. So first, let's create our row that has our brand information. We have our icon, which is an image in here, logo.png, and we also have in here the text. So first, let's create a div that's going to wrap both of those. And we just know that this is for our brand information, so we're going to call it our brand row. And inside of here, we can first put an image tag. So this is going to be for our image. We want to make sure that it has a class of logo, so we can style this in our CSS as our logo. An alt, which is going to also say logo. Essentially, this is for people using screen readers. It'll tell them that this is a logo since they can't actually see the image if they're blind or in some other way cannot see. Also, we're going to put the source here, which is going to be in our images folder, and it's called logo.png. Close that image tag off. And the next thing we need to do is add in the information for our header up here, Web Dev Simplified. So we're going to make this an H2 because it's not our main header for the header section, but it's still really important. So we're using H2 instead of H1. Going to give it a class. Make sure that says H2. I'm going to give it a class here of brand name. And then inside of here, we're just going to put the text Web Dev Simplified, just like that. And now if we save this and we right click this, open it with live server, as long as you have that extension installed, you can see that we have our H2 being shown right here. And you may actually notice that our header here is pushed down really far, and that's because if we highlight this, you can see we have a giant blue section, which is our image, and it's just because our image is really large, it's not scaled down yet. But that's perfectly okay, we'll do that in the CSS later. Next thing we need to focus on is this title section. This is going to be the main section in our content, so we're going to give this an H1 since it's the main section of our page, the main title. And again, a class of title, so we can style this later in our CSS. And we just want to give it that text, which is going to be exclusive course discounts. There we go. And lastly, we're going to have our subtitle here, which is going to be slightly smaller, so we'll make it an H3. It's the least important thing. And we're going to give it a class of subtitle so that we know we actually are going to style this in our CSS just like that. And I'm just going to copy over the text so we don't have to watch me type it out. Paste that in there. And you may notice that in the text here, our Learn React Today is actually italicized. So to make sure that we actually emphasize that in our HTML, let's leave a little bit of room here. And we want to put our Learn React Today on a new line, and we're going to wrap this in an EM, which stands for emphasis, which is going to add emphasis to this and essentially italicize it, or add emphasis to screen readers. Now if we save that, go back to this page over here, you can see that it's italicizing that Learn React Today section for us, which is exactly what we want. Now before we move on to styling this light blue section of our header, I think it'd be a good idea to get started on styling our page with our style sheet. So let's include a style sheet, styles.css, and in our index we want to make sure that we link that. So we can come in here, add in a link. We're just going to put the href here, which is going to point to that styles.css. And lastly, we of course need to tell it that it's a style sheet using that rel, just like this. And there we go, we have our styles.css being included. And I'm just going to paste in here the font family text that we need. Essentially, all you want to do is say the font family, which in our case is Gotham Rounded. We want to say the source of where those files are, which is in this fonts folder here. And you want to tell it which weight and what style it should be using for that font. It's just really repetitive to type out, so I've just thrown it in here for us to use. Now, let's scroll that out of the way and go into styling this first section of our page, which is going to be the body. You notice that we have a little bit of padding here at the bottom of our body, so we want to make sure we include that. So we select our body here. We're going to go padding, bottom. We just want to put 50 pixels of padding on the bottom, just so our page is spaced out from the very bottom of the web page, so when we scroll to the bottom, there's a little bit of white space for us. Also, to make sure our content is centered, we're going to use margin, and we're just going to set 0 for the top and bottom, and auto for the left and right, which is going to center our content in the middle of the screen for us. And then lastly, we want to set the font family for our entire application. So in our case, we're just going to use Gotham Rounded here. You can use whatever font you want, and you also want to put a fallback font. In our case, we're just going to use sans serif as our fallback font. Now if we save that and go back, you can see that our font has immediately changed for us. Now let's go back to our design here to make sure we know what we want to do. And if you remember, we actually created a 6-column design, where all of the content in the header here is in the middle 4 columns, and we have an extra column on the left and right which contains absolutely nothing. In our index.html, we actually made sure to take that into account with this grid column here. So let's actually style that with the grid class. We'll select our grid here, and we just want to change this to be display grid, and we want to set up a 6-column grid. So we're going to use grid template columns, and we just want to repeat 6 times, and we want 1 fr. And this essentially means we're going to have 6 equally spaced out columns because they're all going to take up 1 fractional unit of there, so each one's going to be 1/6 the width of the screen, and they'll scale responsively for us. Also, we want to put a little bit of a gap between our elements. We'll use 20 pixels. We want a little bit of padding, 0 on the top and bottom, and we want 40 on the left and right. This is just going to make sure our content never actually touches the edge of the screen, which is crucial. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we set the grid template areas, and this is going to define where our content is going to go. And if you remember, in our index.html, we have this content section, which we want to be the middle 4 grids, and we want nothing on the left, and we want nothing on the right. So what we can do is we can just put a period, say we want nothing on the left, then we want our content in the center 4, so we'll just write out content 4 times, and then lastly another period because we want nothing on the right side. Now if we save that and go over here, you'll notice nothing actually is working properly. You'll see that everything is in the leftmost column, but we want it to be in the middle 4 columns. And that's because we need to specify, by selecting that content class, we need to specify the grid area here, and we want to set the grid area to content, essentially the same thing as we typed right here. Now when we save that, you see immediately our content is being pushed into the middle 4 columns of our grid with nothing on the left and nothing on the right, which is exactly what we want. Now the last thing we want to do with our content is just make sure it never gets too large. So we're just going to put a max width on it here by typing in max width, and we want this to be just 1000 pixels, and we also want to set the width to be 100%, so we know that it's always going to fill the content that it's given. This way, if we expand our screen on this side, and it becomes over 1000 pixels, our content will no longer expand any farther, and we'll be able to see this later when we start adding more sections to our grid containers. Now, the next thing we need to do is work on styling that header. As we see, we have this dark colored header here, and we again took care of this in our index.html with this dark header class, so let's actually style that now. We can just come down here, type in dark header, And the first thing we want to do is we want to actually change that background color. So we'll come in here, we'll type in background color, and we can actually get this from our design. So if we just come in here, we click on our header section, you'll see that we have our fill color right here, which we can just copy over. We can just paste that into here. Make sure we put that little hashtag in the front. Now if we go over, after we save this, you'll see that we now have that dark blue color being shown up as our background, which is perfect. Also, you'll notice our text is not white, so let's change that real quick. We'll just type the color in here to white. And with that, our header section is really starting to come together. Now let's actually work on styling the content inside of it to be the right sizes. Let's look over here to make sure we know what we're doing. And the first thing we want to do is style our brand row here. As you see, they're on separate lines, and we want them to be on the same line. So we can just select our brand row. What we want to do is we want to change the display to flex. This is going to put them on the same line for us. And we also just want to say that we want everything to be in the center. So we're going to justify and align our items here in the center. Now if we save that and go back, you'll see it's on the same line and everything is centered. Next thing we want to do is actually massively shrink the size of our logo. So let's select our logo here. We're going to change the width to 50 pixels. And we're going to change a margin, which is going to be on the right side. We just want this to be 0.5 rem. This is just going to give us a little bit of space between our logo and our text. Now if we save that, you see that our logo and our text are slightly spaced out from each other, and they're centered in our page perfectly for us. Next thing we want to work on is our title here. So we can come down here, we can select our title, and all we want to do is we want to increase the font size quite a bit. So we're going to say font size is going to be equal to, for example, 3 rem, just like that. Now if we save that, you'll see our font is massively larger. And we also want to make sure it's centered, so we'll just use text align center. Save that, and you'll see now our text is in the dead center of the screen. And now you may notice that this actually isn't exactly like our design because it's on multiple lines, but that's because our design is for desktop over here. So if we expand this out to be desktop sized, you'll see it looks a lot more like our design. And right now what we're first doing is developing for the desktop. So the next thing we want to work on is actually styling this subtitle section. So let's come down here and select that. We'll just say .subtitle, and inside of here we want, to spell subtitle correctly hopefully. There we go. And we want to change the font size first, and it's going to be of course smaller than our title, so we'll make it for example 1.5 rem, about half the size. We want to again align the content in the center, so it's text align center here. And we want to change the font weight because right now it's bolded and we don't want it to be bold, so we'll just change it to normal here. Now when we save that, you see it gives us a much lighter text on this, which is looking perfect. Expand this out and you see it looks really great on that larger desktop sized screen. But you will notice we don't have this fancy curved section that we do over here. And in order to get that fancy curve section is actually really difficult to do in CSS. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take the power here of our design and we're actually going to pull out that curved section. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take this header section, we're going to copy it, drag it over here. So now we have a copy of this header section. And what we want to do is we want to shrink it down to the smallest size possible. That includes the actual bottom portion of our wave. So if you can see here, all we have now is this very bottom portion of our wave. And this is what we want to actually export into our application. And I've already done this using a slightly different looking wave than this, but essentially it's the same exact concept. You want to do the same thing for the bottom portion of the wave, cutting off everything except for the very bottom portion here of our wave, so we can include that in our application. And you want to make sure again that you do this as an SVG. So now if we look over here, I have that dark background SVG and the light background SVG, which are going to be used for this section. And what we want to do is we just want to add a div to our container here. So let's add another div. We're going to make this after our dark header here. We're just going to put it down here. And we're going to give this here a class, which is going to be dark header divider, because this is going to be the wave that divides all of our content. And we don't need anything inside of it. Now we can go back into our styles here and we can actually select that dark header divider. So we can say dark header divider. And all we want to do is we want to first set the background image. So we can come in here, background image. We want to set it to a URL, and this URL is going to be in our images folder, and it's called darkbackground.svg. Now, if we look over here, save our application, and you'll notice that nothing's actually shown up, and that's because we need to make our dark header a little bit bigger. So to do that, we'll just come in here, we're going to set a height to 150 pixels, and now if we save that, you'll see that our wave is actually being shown up in our application. But there's a little bit of spacing between our wave and the other background. In order to get around that, all we need to do is just add a margin top that's slightly negative. So we'll just say -5 pixels, and that'll blend those two into each other perfectly for us. You'll also notice that the color between our background here and our background up here are slightly different. So in order to get around that, we can just copy our background color from our dark header and paste it into the fill section of our dark header SVG. And as you can see, those both line up perfectly. Now we can close out of this, scroll all the way back down, and we want to make a few more changes to our dark header so that our background is positioned where we want it to be. To do that, we can just use background position of bottom left. And what this is going to do is it's going to put the bottom left-hand section of our background image right here for us. Also, we want to make sure that our background image always fills the entire available height. So to do that, we can just use background size, and we want to set this to cover. Now if we save that, it'll just essentially make it so that our background always fills all of the available space that it's given to us. Now as we expand our page and shrink our page, you can see that that wave is able to scale all the way across all different browser sizes without looking terrible in any of the different sizes. And with that, that's all we need to do for our dark header section of our grid. Now we can move on to styling the light header section with the email field. So in order to do that, it's going to be very similar to our dark header section. All we need to do is come down here below our divider. And what we want to do is we want to have first a div that's going to have a class here of light header, because this is going to be the light section of our header. And again, that same exact grid class. We can close that off. And again, we're going to want our section to be inside of a content here. So we're just going to have a div with the class of content. And in here, we're going to have a form for our email and our button. So let's create a form. And this form is just going to have a class, which is going to say email form. And we don't really have any action that we can post to right now. But if you're doing this for a live site, you would want to put in an action here, something like /email. And you'd want to have a method, which would be, for example, post. We can close that off. Enter down here. Let's make our screen a little bit bigger so it's easy to see everything. There we go. And now inside of here, we want to put our input. So we can just have an input. This is going to have a type of email. And we want to set a name of email so we can get it on our server when we submit it. And lastly, a placeholder, which we're just going to put enter your email as the placeholder. It really doesn't matter what the placeholder is. You can do whatever you want. Now, the next thing we need is our join now button. This is going to be a type here of submit. And the text inside of here is just going to be join now. You can even put an exclamation point in there, save that, go over to here, and you can see we have our enter email as well as our join now button. Lastly, we're just going to need to use another divider, which is going to go at the very end here, and this is going to be instead our light header divider. Whoops, make sure I spell light correctly, and that's all the HTML for this light blue section of our page. Let's jump into the style sheet and actually start styling it, and the very first thing we can start with is our light header, because it's going to be very similar to the dark header. Instead of here, we want to change the color to be white for our text. And we also want to change here our background color, and we want to make this our brand color, which in my case is just going to be 00AAFF. That's that light blue color that you can see on the right side here. And you can just pull this from Figma if you need. Now if we go over and look at our page, you can see that we have that nice blue section. But the problem is that this blue is actually getting cut off by our background for our div up here. We want our blue to expand all the way up to our dark blue section over here. And in order to do that, what we need to do is we actually need to set some padding on the top. So we're going to say we want to have a padding on the top, which is going to be 500 pixels. And we want to have a margin on the top, which is negative 500 pixels. And essentially what this is going to do is it's going to pad our content down 500 pixels and then move it up negative 500 pixels. But the background color will move with it. So if we save that, you'll see that our background is being moved up, which is perfect. I'm going to remove this margin and save it, and you can see it adds a bunch of padding on the top of our section, moves everything down, but by adding the negative margin in there, it moves everything back up to where it used to be. But of course this is a bit problematic because we don't want our light blue section to be shown over top of our dark blue section. But we can use z-index in order to fix that problem. So instead of our dark header here, let's change the position to relative so that we can actually use z-index, and we set the z-index here to be 1. And if we save that, you'll see that it's now being shown up over top of our light blue. Let's just copy this, go down to our dark header divider, and do the exact same thing. We'll paste that in there and save it, and now you'll see both our dark header divider as well as our dark header are being shown up over top of our light blue section. While we're on the topic of headers, let's actually do the exact same thing that we need to do for our light header. I'm just going to copy all of this because our light header is almost exactly the same as the dark header, but our image is going to be slightly different. We're going to use the light background instead of the dark background, and we don't actually want to position this relative or z-index because we want it to be behind everything. Now if we save that, you see that our light header is being shown up down here as our divider, and again, even when we scale our browser to all different sizes, you'll see that it looks really good on all available sizes. Now we can get to work on actually styling our email form down here. Let's look at our actual design so we make sure that we know exactly what we want to do. We can come down here. We created a class called email form, which is going to be the container that wraps both of our elements. And essentially what we want to do in here is display flex to make it easier for us to position our elements and make them grow and shrink responsively. We also want to make sure everything is always in the center, so we'll justify the content in the center. We're going to put a margin top here of 4 rem. What this is going to do is if we come over here and save it, you'll see it's just going to push our content down. It gives us some spacing from the top section of our container, which is really useful. Also, we want some spacing from the bottom, so we're going to use margin on the bottom. And in our case, this is just going to be 1 rem, and it's just going to make our bottom section a little bit longer, which is perfect. Lastly, to increase the font size, we're just going to do font size here of 1.75 rem, and save that, and you can see now our font size is much larger. Now with the styling of the actual container done, let's work on styling our elements. The first thing we want to style is the email form input. So we'll just select that here, and let's go back over to our design, make sure we know exactly what we want to do. And we want to first set the background to white, because as you can see on the right hand side, we have a background of white on our element, and we also want to change the color here of our text. And this color is the exact same color as our dark background. So let's just copy that all the way down here for our color, paste that in, and we're going to save that. If we look back over here, you'll see we have the white background, and when we go to type in the box, you'll see we get that blue colored text, which is perfect. Now go back to our design, just so we make sure that we're following along everything perfectly. And we can come in, we can set a border. In our case, this is going to be a 2 pixel solid black border. And again, you can pull this directly from the design. When you click on this, it'll tell you that it's a 2 pixel solid black border. Also, we're going to want to set the border radius, which in our case, we're just going to use 0.5 EM. This way our border radius actually scales with the size of the text of our input element. We also want to add padding, and again, we're going to do this using EM so that it scales with the size of our text. So we're going to use 0.5 EM and 1 EM. Now let's save that and look back over here to see what it looks like, and you can see it's added a lot of extra spacing around our element for us and really just made it look a little bit beefier. Now come back over here, the last thing we need to do is just add a little bit of spacing around everything. So we're going to use a margin on the right hand side. This is just going to be 1 EM, and we also want to make sure we remove the outline from the element for when we click on it. And of course, we want to make sure that this element, our input, grows as large as it can, so we're going to use flex grow, and we're going to set it to 1. This way it's just going to be as large as humanly possible. As you can see, it's very large and our button is very small. Now, since we removed that outline for when we click on the element, we want to make sure we add some kind of visual indicator for when we focus on this. So we'll say email form input, and we want to make it so when we focus on it that we actually change the background color. So we'll come in here, we'll change the background color, and you just want to use a lightish gray color. In our example, we're just going to use DCF3FF. And an easy way to actually select these styles is if you just come over here, you can just drag this around wherever you want, and whatever it lands on that's relatively similar, it will work for you. So for example, when we click, you'll see that it slightly changes the color of our input element, just so the user knows that they're actually selecting the input element. Now with that out of the way, let's move on to styling the actual button here. So we'll say email form button, and this is going to have a color here of white. As we can see from our design over here, we have a white color, and we also have a background color, which is almost completely black. It's 111, which is just a really dark gray. And we have a border here, which is going to be our 2 pixels solid white border. It kind of mirrors our input element border. And our border radius and padding, we actually want to copy this exactly the same as what our email form input does, so that we have a very consistent feel between the button and the actual input element it corresponds with. Now let's save that and look over here to see how that looks, and you can see that it's already starting to look pretty good, but we want to make it a little bit wider. So what we can do is we can just set a max width here of 250 pixels, so it'll actually grow to be that 250 pixel size when our screen is larger. As you can see, if we expand our screen, you can see that it grows to that size, but as soon as it gets there, it doesn't grow any farther, which is perfect for our use case. Also, we want to make sure that when we hover over this, we get the pointer icon. So we're going to come in here, cursor pointer. So now you can see we get the pointer icon when we hover. And very lastly, what we need to do is select our email form button. And we want to say when we hover over the button, or when we have actually focused it, so email form button focus, what we want to do is we just want to change that background color. So we're going to come in here, we're going to say the background color, we're just going to make it 333, which is just a lighter gray color, and when we hovered over that, it makes it very obvious to the user that this button is clickable and hoverable. Now with that header section completely done, it's time to move on to the main content of our page, which is this video element, as well as these benefits over here. Let's do that in our index.html. Outside of our header, this is going to be the main section, so the main content, so we want to put it inside of the main. And we have two sections. We have this details section, as well as this more general section. So let's create a section here, and this first section is going to be our grid for our video. So we're going to get it a class of grid, because as I mentioned, everything inside of our design is based on that same exact grid, but this grid is slightly different the way the elements are laid out, so we're going to give it a special class, grid video, so we can style this grid to be the 50-50 grid as opposed to the centered grid. Next, we want to actually put the video inside of here, so we'll just say our video, and this video is going to have a poster, which is going to be our thumbnail. So we have our thumbnail.jpg, and this essentially is just the thumbnail that's going to show up over the top of the video. Also, we want to just say that we want to use controls on this video. This just allows the user to play and pause the video as they see fit. And video is a little bit weird because you actually need to put the video source inside of here. So we're going to say that the source here with a source tag is going to be our thumbnail.jpg, it's going to be our video.mp4, and we need to tell it the type, which in our case is going to be video/mp4, which is the type of file that we're using. Now if we save that and go over here, you can see that our video is being shown up. It's very large, we'll change that later, but our video at least is being shown up. Next thing we want to work on is the HTML for our benefits section. So let's actually make a div which is going to contain that. We'll give it a class here, which is going to be benefits section, just like that, and make sure we spell benefits right. There we go. Close that off, and inside of here we're going to have a div for each one of our benefits. So we're going to give it a class here of benefit, just like that, and inside of here, make sure we close that off. We're going to have our image tag as well as our text. So let's put first our image. We're going to give it a source, and this one's going to come from our images folder, and this very first one is our email icon, so we'll use email icon.svg, and we're also going to give it an alt. Again, this is for screen readers, so we just want to describe what the image is, so we're just going to say that the image is an email icon. We can close that off, and then after here, we're going to put our text, which is just email updates, just like that. And we can copy this down a couple times, copy that down, make sure we fix our indentation. There we go. And this next one, instead of being email, this is going to be our money icon. Make sure that's spelled correctly. Money icon, there we go. And this last one is going to be our extra content one. So extra content icon. And we want to make sure we change our alt. This one here is going to just say money. And this one down here is just going to say extra content icon. And we can change our text. Special discounts. This is the real fun part of the video, isn't it? And exclusive discounts. There we go. Make sure I spell exclusive right. There we go. Now we can actually move on to styling these two sections of our grid. The first thing we need to do is tell our grid how we want it to look. So let's go up to where we define the rest of our grid information up here, and let's select our grid video that we just created. And inside of here, what we want to do is going to be slightly different. Our grid template areas, we no longer have that content section. What we have is we have a video which takes up half the screen, so we'll do 3 videos, and we have benefits which takes up the other half, so we'll just do 3 benefits here. So essentially what this is saying is the first 3 columns should be our video, and then the next 3 columns should be the benefits. Now, in order to get our video to actually show up in the video section, we need to select our video. We can just do that by saying grid video and our video element. What we want to do in here is we just want to set the grid area, and we want to set it to be video. Now we can save that and see how that looks, and you can see it actually doesn't really change anything. And that's because we need to make sure we define our width for our video to be 100%, so that it never expands past 100% of the container. And as you can see now, it's showing up on half of the grid, which is perfect. Also, just to make sure our video never gets too big if our screen gets really large, we just want to set the max width here to 900 pixels. And now when we expand our screen, you see that our video is never going to get too large. It's always going to stay under 900 pixels, which is perfect for our use case. Another thing we want to do is, you noticed when I expanded this very large, you see our content is right up against our divider here. We don't actually want that. We want to make sure we shrink that down and add a little bit of margin. So we're just going to come in here, add a margin of top, which is going to be 50 pixels, just like that. And we also want to make sure our benefits are aligned in the center of our actual video. So we're going to come in here and align our items in the center. And if we save that, you'll see that everything is lined up center. So now our benefits over here are lined up in the center with our video. Now with our video completely styled, we can move on to styling our benefits section and actually making sure we add that grid area to it. So let's come down here all the way to the bottom. We're just going to call it the benefits section class that we created. And we want to first add that grid area, which is going to be benefits, just like that. And if we save that, you'll immediately see this expands out to fill that entire section of our content, which is great. Also, we want to space it out a little bit from our video. So we're just going to use a margin on the left here, which is going to be 3 rem. 3 rem, just like that. And you can see now it's spaced out from our video, which is perfect. Also, we want to increase the font size drastically because this is the main point of our page. As you can see over here, the font size is really large. So let's actually go down and select our benefit, just like this. So each individual benefit, what we want to do is we want to take the font size, we want to increase that to 3 rem. And we also want to add a little bit of space between them, so we'll use a margin bottom of 3 rem as well. And this is not going to look very good on this smaller screen, but when we expand to our larger screen, you can see that it really pops and fills up the information on our screen. So let's shrink that back down so it's easier to work with. And what we want to do is we also want to use display flex so we can easily align our items inside of our benefits section. So to do that, we can just come up here, and we first want to justify here the container, and we want to justify this using flex start. This is just going to make sure our items line up all the way on the left hand side. When we expand full screen, you see that they're lined up on the left instead of lined up in the center of our grid. This is just to make it look better on full screen. And then inside of our benefit here, we're going to use the display flex. And we also want to make sure here we are aligning our items in the center. So we'll say align items center, and And this is just going to make sure that our content is all on the same line as each other and everything is perfectly centered. Also, let's make sure we add that semicolon. So now you can see our image is perfectly centered with our text. But our image is looking a little bit small, as you can see, compared to our text. So let's actually select that. We'll say benefit. We want to select the image. And all we want to do is we want to change the height in here to be 3 rem. This is the exact same size as our font size, so they should look exactly the same. And if you save that, you see that this actual icon, if we expand our screen, is the exact same size as the text, so they line up really well. We just need to add a little bit of margin, so we'll say margin on the right hand side, and we just want to add, for example, 2 rem, and that's just going to space out our icon from our image. Now let's expand this to be full screen size, and you can see for the desktop, this is looking almost exactly the same as our design over here is looking, which is perfect. Now we can finally move on to the last section of our web design, which is going to be this benefits details section down below. Let's shrink down our browser so that we can actually start working with this. Go into our index.html, and this is going to be a new section that we create down here. And this section is again going to be a grid, so we're going to make sure we add that grid class. But again, this grid, as you can see, is a 3-column grid as opposed to this centered grid or this half and half grid. So we need to add another class to make sure that we can style it properly. And this is going to be grid benefit detail, just so we know what grid we're working with down here and we can actually apply those specific styles. Now inside of here, we just need 3 different sections. We need to have a benefit detail 1, 2, and 3. So let's create a div, give it a class here, which is going to be benefit detail. There we go, if I can spell. Close that off, perfect. Make sure that's actually closed, there we go. And inside of this benefit detail, we have our title and our content. So let's come in here, create a div, which is going to be for our title. We'll call it benefit detail title. And in here, we'll put our title. For example, this one's going to be email updates. Let's make sure we put this on a new line just so it looks a little bit cleaner. There we go. And then we're going to have our content. So for example, we're going to have a class here, which is going to be benefit detail text. And in here, I'm just going to copy over this text because no one wants to watch me type that all out. And there we go. That's all of our text. Make sure it's indented properly. And now all we need to do is just copy this and do it 2 more times. So I'm going to copy this code, paste it down 2 more times. Make sure I indent everything properly. There we go. And this is, instead of email updates, this is going to be special discounts. And I'm going to copy this text inside of here, paste it down. And as you remember, in here we have all future bolded. So what we want to do is we just want to find that section, put it on a new line, and we're just going to use a strong emphasis on this. Put that all future section in there. This is going to bold it and add emphasis to this section for us. And now if we save this, look over here, scroll down, you see that all future is bolded for us. And now the very last thing we need to do is in our last section here, we want this to say extra content, and we want to just copy this text over. There we go. Indent that properly, save it, and now we have all of our different text inside of this section here, as well as our headers. And with that, our HTML for the application is complete. We can move on to styling our application, and the first thing I want to do is actually style our grid. So we can say grid benefits detail, which is the detail section for our grid. It's actually details here. Whoops, nope, just detail. And we want to do a margin on the top of 4 rem. Now if we save that, you see it just spaced our content out down here from the content over here, which looks great. Now we can actually move on to styling the individual benefits themselves. Let's scroll all the way down to the bottom here so that we have a distinct section for our benefit details. And we're going to select that wrapper class that wrapped each one of our individual details, which is called benefit detail. And in here, we want to say that it's going to span 2 columns of our grid. So we're going to say grid column span 2. And if you save that, you see immediately everything is spanning 2 columns, and it looks a lot more like a design over here. The next thing we want to do is we want to actually add a little bit of margin between these elements. So we're just going to say margin here, which is going to be 2 rem. And if we save that, come over here, you see our content is much more spaced out from each other. Next, we want to select our title. So we can say benefit detail title. And inside of our title, we first, of course, want to align our text in the center. And we also want to increase that font size. In our case, we're just going to use 1.75 rem. And we want to change the color because in our design over here, we used a 333 color, which is just a lightish gray color. It's fairly dark. And lastly, add a little bit of margin to the bottom. We'll just say 2 rem to space out our header from our content. Now if we save that, go back, you can see immediately we have these nice headers, which are spaced out from our content below. Next thing we need to do is actually style our detailed text. And inside of here, we want our font size to be slightly smaller. So we're just going to use 1.5 rem instead of 1.75. The color is also slightly lighter, which is just going to be 444. There we go. And we want the font weight as well to be a lighter font weight. So we're just going to use lighter to make it less bold. And if you save that, you see immediately our text is larger thinner and a little bit lighter colored. Now if we expand here, you can see that this looks really good on our desktop view. And actually, if we compare this to our design over here and over here, our page looks exactly the same on desktop. But we still have a lot of work to make it look good on the smaller mobile scale, because right now this is very unusable. And when you're designing, a really easy way to figure out where your breakpoint should be on where you should change your design based on the size is if you just inspect the page using the browser tools. You can see when you expand it, left and right, in the top corner, you see that we have the size of our page. So let's expand this to be almost the entire size of our page. And as you can see, when we drag this bar, you can see this width of our page at the top. And when we get to around, let's say about this size, 1200 pixels, we actually just want our content to expand all the way to the edges of our side, because right now this starts to get a little scrunched when we get below that, 1200 pixel range. So we're going to make our first cutoff at this 1200 pixel number. Let's close that off, expand this so we can start typing our text, and we can come down here and we can use media queries for that. So we can just say media, we want to say when the max width is 1200 pixels. So essentially, for everything under 1200 pixels, this code is going to be run. And what we want to do is, like I said, we want to expand these grid sections to take up the full width. So we can just come in here, we can select our grid, and we can just make it a one column grid. So we can say that our grid template columns is just going to be 1FR, and we want the grid template area for that. So we can say grid template, template areas. And the only thing in here is going to be our content. So we'll just type out content like this. And as you can see immediately, that makes all of our top sections expand to full width, but our bottom sections don't quite look right. So what we want to do is we actually need to modify our other grids. So we're going to take our grid for our video here. What we're going to do is we're again going to change this to be a one column grid. So we're going to say our grid, template columns is going to be 1FR. But what we want to do is we want this to be a two-lined grid because we want this video on the top section and our benefits below it. So we can use our grid template areas to do that. So we'll say grid template, template areas. And the first thing we want is our video, so we'll put that inside of quotes. And then after that, inside of separate quotes, we'll put benefits. And this essentially says row number 1 is video and row number 2 is benefits. Now, if we save that, you can see immediately our benefits are moved below our video, but our benefits are now no longer in the center of our page. We want them to be centered with our video. So that's actually really easy to do. We can just come down here, we can say benefits section. In this benefits section, what we want to do is we just want to justify the self in the center. If you save that, you see it now centers our benefits, and we also want to add a little bit of margin. So we'll say margin on the top is going to be 2 rem, and we're going to remove the margin from the left of this. So we're just going to say margin left of 0. Now if we save that, you can see that's all looking really good. The last thing to notice is if we scale this up to around that 1200 pixel size, where everything gets cut onto the one line, which is right here, these actually don't look that good when they're on one individual line. We want this grid to still be 6 different columns. So we can just come down here and select that. We can just say we want our grid for our benefit, benefit detail. We want this to be a grid template columns of 6 rows. So we can just say repeat 6 times 1FR. And there we go. Now you can see that it's lined up on 6 different columns like this, which actually looks much better when you're at this size right here. You'll also notice that our video is not properly centered, so let's actually make sure we change that as well. We can just select that by doing .grid, video, and we just want to justify the content, justify self, and we want this to be in the center. Now when we expand our screen, you see that our video stays in the center of the screen just like this, which is exactly what we want. Now that everything looks fairly good at this size, let's actually hunt for where our next breakpoint should be. We'll inspect the page, make sure we expand this so we can see everything. So here is our 1200 breakpoint where everything cuts off to the next screen. So if we expand down here and we look at this section down here, because we notice that this is starting to get kind of scrunched, as soon as we get to around this 1000 pixel mark, you can see that it really starts to become hard to read, and we probably want to expand this to be just the same as the rest of our grids. So let's actually create a breakpoint at 1000 pixels to do that. Let's increase this size here. We're going to come down here, create another media query. So we'll say media. We want the max width of this one to be 1000 pixels. Just like that. And inside of here, the only thing we want to style is that benefits grid. So we'll say grid benefit detail. And what we want to do is just make it a one column grid. So we'll say grid template columns is 1FR. Now if we save that, you can see at that 1000 pixel size, this is going to show up in one column. But if we increase our page here to be past that, it'll be on the 3 different columns just like this. And this is looking really good. Now again, let's do a little bit more hunting to see where our next breakpoint should be. We can scale this up, and right now we're at that 1000 breakpoint. And if we start scaling down, you can see that our text is starting to become really large. This section especially is very large on our screen, and this is around this 800 pixel mark that we want to start scaling our text sizes down and making everything a little bit easier to work with in that regard. And this will start to look a lot more like our mobile design over here, where you can see our text sizes are much smaller and everything is one single column as opposed to side by side, as is some of our elements still on the page. So let's get this back into working order, expand up our code section so it's easier to code. And the first thing we need to do is again create another media query, this time which is going to be at 800 pixels. So we'll say at media, this is going to be a max width of 800 pixels. And inside of here, we're going to want to make sure all of our content is styled inside of one column. So the first place we want to look is that email form at the top of our page there. All we need to do is change our flex direction to be column based, and immediately that's going to stack our elements one on top of each other. But of course, this doesn't look quite right. We need to change our button so that it's a lot larger. So we want to say our email form button. Inside of here, we want to set the max width. And we just want to remove that max width that we impaired on it earlier, because before we set like a 250 max width. So we just want to change this back to the initial value. So now if we say that, you see it's going to fill the full size for us, which is great. And we also want to set the width to 100%, so it's always going to fill the entire space. There we go. Now we also want to change our input. You see there's margin on it. We don't want that, so we'll say email form input. And inside of here, we just want to get rid of that margin. So we'll say margin right is going to be 0. And we also want to add a little bit of margin on the bottom so it pushes it away from our button. And there we go. You can see that looks good. And lastly, we'll also set the width to be 100% just so it always fills the entire width of our container. And we're actually going to use max width here instead of width, and that's just going to make sure that the maximum it can ever be is 100%, which is exactly what we wanted. Now let's move on down here, and you can see our benefits definitely need to be shrunk in size. So let's select those. We can just say benefit, and we want to reduce the font size. In our case, we'll just use 2 rem, and we save that, and you can see immediately it's gotten a lot smaller, but our icons also need to shrink. So let's select those using benefit image, and inside of here, we just want to change the height to be the same as that font size. We'll use 2 rem. And we also want to add a less of a margin, so we'll say our margin right is now 1 rem, just to get those a little bit close to each other. And as you can see, that's looking really good. Now overall, I think this is looking fairly good at this size. So let's actually come in here, we're going to inspect it and look for another breakpoint, which is probably going to be our last breakpoint. And I think in the most part, this is going to be in our header section because it's starting to get really cramped, especially as we get down here in these really small 500 pixel size or so. This header is starting to look really cramped. Also, if we scale down here, the rest of this is actually looking pretty good, but our header for sure needs to change when we get down below 500 pixels. So we're going to use 500 pixels as our next cutoff for our header section. And again, over here, as you can see, we actually removed that text for Web Dev Simplified from our header because it just didn't quite look right at that smaller size. So let's come in here, we'll use an at media, and we want to make sure that this is a max width, which is going to be 500 pixels. And this is going to be for our smallest mobile size. And now what we're going to do in here is we're going to drastically reduce all of our font sizes as well as get rid of that header to make it a lot smaller. So we're first going to take that brand name and we're just going to completely remove it. We can just come in here, we can use display none, save that, come over here, make sure that we're below 500 pixels. And you can see immediately that brand name has completely disappeared. Also, we need to add a little bit of margin to the top of our logo. So we'll come in here, select our logo, and add a margin top of 1 rem, just so it's pushed away from the top of the page like that. Also, we want to come down here and we want to select our email form next because as you can see, this is way too large. We need to shrink this text size down. So we'll say email form, and we want to set a margin here, which is going to be 0, and a font size, which is going to be 1.25 rem. Now if we save that, you see that it's shrunk down a lot, which is really nice. Also, down here in our benefits, they're again a little bit too large. So we can come in here, select our benefits, and we can change the font size. And we can just make this 1.25 rem, and there we go, that's looking a lot better. Also, our image needs to shrink down as well. Whoops, make sure to spell it correctly, there we go. And make sure we do the same thing for our image, so we'll say benefit, image, and we want to set the height here, which is going to be 1.25 rem, and we want to again reduce that margin, so we'll use margin on the right, which is going to be 0.5 rem. There we go. Now that's much closer together and looks really nice on this smaller screen size. Now the last thing to change is this benefit section down here. So we can just come down. We can select our benefit detail title because we want to make sure that has a smaller font size. We're just going to use again 1.25 rem for that font size. And we're going to select our benefit text section. So we'll say benefit detail text. And we're going to again reduce the font size of this to be slightly smaller at 1.15 rem, and there you go, that's drastically shrunk down for us. Another thing we want to do is these benefit details are way too spaced out from each other. So let's go down here and make sure we select our benefit detail, just like that. And we want to just set the margin here to, for example, 1 rem, which is just going to put those a lot closer to each other. Also, our benefit details section should actually probably have a lot less margin on the top here, so let's select that. Our benefit detail, and this is actually grid benefit detail, just like that. We can just come in here and we can reduce this margin on the top to, for example, 1 rem, and that's going to put these much closer to each other, which actually looks really good. And that's essentially our entire mobile version of our site complete. Now let's expand this out, and if we see if it looks good on desktop, and as you can see at the full resolution desktop, it looks good, and as we shrink it down, everything in our site expands and contracts as it needs to be completely mobile responsive. And with that, you just designed your very own responsive website, which looks great. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to check out my other videos linked over here, and don't forget to check out the design version of this video if you haven't already seen it. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this in the future. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.